Lori, over to you.
Okay, thank you all. Well, first of all, a hearty welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. This is going to be a very informative session for chapter leaders, even those who are not treasurers. We're going to be going over the budget process, the submission process, finding out more about what that involves. We have two very informative presenters today. Bobbi Werner is the STC treasurer, and Liz Pohland is the CEO of STC. And they are going to educate us today and refresh our memories about the whole process that we go through during budget season. So we're really glad you're here, and I think you're going to learn a lot. So this is what the agenda looks like. We're going to be here about an hour. We're going to go through the budget template, community funding, what that means, pass-through funding, the whole budgeting process, important dates for submissions, especially for tax filing, a little bit about chapter bank accounts, chapter EIN addresses, and community email addresses to use as part of the whole budgeting process. We'll share some resources with you and links that might be helpful to you. And then we'll put the floor open for questions. And your questions are welcome. We will go through the formal presentation first, and then we will address your questions. And as Erin said, please feel free to put the questions in the chat as well. Okay, Bobbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I need to say something about my voice to start. The reason we rescheduled was because last week I had no voice. And the running joke among my friends is that I lost my voice 3 weeks ago and I found someone else's. This is not how I normally sound, so please bear with me. I hope that this records properly and audibly. So if you have any issues understanding anything I say, please put in a question in the chat. But I feel like I'm shouting, but it's the only thing I can do to make my vocal cords work. So please bear with me. This is going to be an interesting presentation. So the first thing I want to say is that if you look back at the previous slide, actually, there is a reference to a 2020 recording that Jim Bousquet put together, which walks you step by step through the template. I am not going to do that today. That recording is essentially all you need to know, aside from a couple of additional bits of information we have to share with you today. I'm going to talk about minor changes to the template that we're implementing this year. So if we go on then to the next slide, I want to highlight a couple of things that I think will make the budgeting process go a whole lot more smoothly for the committee that looks at all of the budget submissions. So the one thing I'll point out is the yellow column that is new this year. And what we have opted to do is to include another year of actual data. We want to see your actual receipts and expenses for this year up to the point of the date of your submission. So we'll talk about due dates in a moment, but all of you who have the template, you already know what that is. But one of the things we realized as we were going through our reviews last year is that we were really curious to know how things were going this year, whether you were how you were following through on your activity reports and your engagement plans, I should say. So this gives us a better view of that. And I think that in addition to what we're asking for in the notes column will get us further along. What we found last year, again, looking at a number of the budget submissions, was that there were, in many cases, notes that related to previous years. And so we're trying to make sense of that with your request for the current year of, in this case, 2023. And it was confusing. But the other thing that we realized too is that there are a number of items on the budget template that allow you to combine a lot of different expenditures. And if you don't itemize what those are, we don't really have all the information we need as a committee to see how all of those things are being expended. So the note down at the bottom says that if you can itemize revenue and expenses that are presented as a sum, if there's a sum there and it breaks down into 2 or 3 different items, use the notes to tell us what those different itemized expenditures are. And the same is true for revenue. If you are doing an event with another organization, a SIG or a chapter, and there's opportunity to be a bit more specific than what the total will tell us. All of that is really good information for us. The other thing that happened with our committee reviews last year, we found that we had many questions, and we had to send the budgets back to the chapters or the SIGs for more information. We're trying to avoid some of that so that we can streamline our process. So I would say it's probably difficult to be excessive in your notes. I would say tell us whatever you can that will be informative and that will just give us a bit more context for evaluating the budget submission. Okay. All right, we can go on to the next slide. So here are just some key pointers about how community funding operates. Your annual budget request is your funding request for the next fiscal year. And there are certain things that we want everybody to know. If there's any mystery about this, there really shouldn't be. But there are certain things that are required of communities in order to qualify for the funding from STC. One is that you have to be current on any financial reporting required for you. So for chapters, that includes a 990 tax filing. You have to meet your deadlines for your annual reports that tell us what your expenditures are for the previous year. All of those things need to be on file. And then as far as the actual budget submission itself is concerned, you either need to meet the deadline for it or an agreed to extension of that deadline. So those 3 things come together and then kind of pave the way for the budget review process by the committee. Again, based on the number of members of your community, at the end of the STC year, which is August 31st for 2022, your membership total on that date will determine the pass-through for the next year. So for chapters, on August 31st, your membership times $15 will be your pass-through funding. For SIGs, it's $5 per member, and that's the community of practice. Communities of interest, there is no pass-through. And the other thing that, again, is kind of anticipating questions that come up repeatedly about why it's $15 and not $20 or $25 for the pass-through funding. And that is because there is overhead in the STC office, a lot of work that needs to be accounted for that accounts for some of the costs that are not transferred to, or the funding that is not transferred to the communities. All right, so I think enough said on that one. We can go to the next slide. You're so patient with my voice. I hope I see notes in the chat. Thank you very much. I hope I get it back too. So the budgeting process, some of you may be doing this for the first time, and that's admittedly a very daunting process. But even for veterans, it's not always the easiest thing to do. But there are some standard practices that I think will make it go more smoothly for you. One is to collect your past budgets. So if you have just taken on the role of treasurer, connect with past treasurers, or maybe find where your documentation is stored on a Google Drive or wherever your chapter keeps or archives its records. And of course, that presumes that they exist. They should be available to your chapter leadership year after year. But go ahead and collect that information and review your programs and services so that you can make plans for what you intend to do in the next year, in 2023. So again, I think point 2 also reinforces that. Use your past budgets and financial statements for reference, and take a look at how revenue came in on certain activities. Take a look at your expenses, see how those things balance out. Have you been able to operate in the red, or have you earned money over the course of the past years? And that might influence some of your decisions about how to budget for the new year. Are you taking on some new goals or initiatives? I'm thinking of some communities that are really focusing on reaching out to student communities at local universities. Well, how are you going to budget for that in terms of expenses? Do you need to budget for food, for meeting rooms? Do you have a sponsor that might help you? And maybe someone's workplace will offer a conference room for you to host an event, or there's a community room that you can get a hold of. But try to again think about what that range of expenses might be, but of course also think about revenue. Determine surplus and shortfall. So this is usually an iterative process. You create something and you see how things balance out. And if they look too far, if they look problematic, then obviously go back and rework. But this should be something that your entire administrative council for your chapter or for your community plays a role in. So think about what your goals are for programming. We're not talking just about the budget piece of this. There's also the activity report looking back at, in this case, 2022, but then also your engagement plan. What are you planning to do for 2023? Those should be things that you're all talking about and that you want to provide as much detail as possible so that we can see how you intend to serve your membership and how you have served them. So once you work all of this out with your chapter leadership, you submit those items to STC. And again, on the template is the instruction for who to send those items to. Just as a reminder, it's Liz and Aaron and myself. And get all of that sent to us. And then the committee, which also includes Lori, will begin reviewing those starting mid-November, actually. And I guess I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. That's on the next slide. But again, some clarification about how this funding, the pass-through funding, is addressed. Chapters receive one payout once we approve a budget. So shortly after that, the funding is processed, and you'll either receive a check, an actual check, or depending on how you set it up, you might have a direct deposit or a transfer into an account. So that's part of what you need to clarify when you complete your budget request form. And then as far as the SIG COP funds, they're earmarked for the year. They do not roll over year over year, but any profit you make outside of that pass-through funding will continue year over year. And expenses for SIG COPs are paid after receiving and processing reimbursement requests. So we ask that you complete those reimbursement requests in a timely manner. There are some deadlines that toward the end of the year that you need to adhere to. And I don't think we've spelled those out specifically here, but we want to avoid the rush of expenses that have not been approved in the month of December. It's a very difficult month, and things we need to close down the books and things need to be audited. And so I think the deadline for expenses that are COP related in December need to be submitted. Is it December 1st or December 15th?
I think it's December 15th.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
the absolute deadline.
Yeah. So, and that's with the intention, not of derailing any plans to spend, but just to make sure that those expenditures are anticipated and properly accounted for before the end of the year. Okay, so next slide, please. Here's where we get into some of the key dates. So last year we made the deadline the 31st of October. And I know that's coming up. It's on Monday. And we know we're having this webinar pretty close to that deadline. So if you need an extension, you need to ask for it by the deadline. We have absolutely no problem granting an extension, especially with how things are coming together a bit late this year. On the flip side, though, the extension deadline has changed, and that's what's highlighted in yellow. We used to have the extension deadline as December 31st. But I can tell you that given the volume of budgets that came in at the end of the year, it just really got in the way of the committee getting its work done as early and as productively as it needs to, really. So we pulled that in to December 1st. So an extra month if you need it to work out your budgets. Please get them in by that time. And, again, as I said, if you need an extension until December 1st or sometime in between, simply request it with an email. The Budget Review Committee is going to start doing its reviews in the middle of November. So we'll get those budget submissions. Some will come in early. Some will come in by Monday next week. Some will come in a week later. But we need to get started so that we can make progress. And the goal is to be able to have funds starting to be transferred to the communities early in the new year. I will tell you that this past year, well, in this year, we believe it or not, we are still dealing with some transfers to communities. So, we don't want to be in that situation, and we want to be able to expeditiously get the funding that the communities need into those bank accounts. So the other deadline that's significant for communities is May 15th. And there are two different things that are due at that time. And I think there's an exception in maybe it's Colorado or Arizona, I can't remember which of the southwestern states, where the deadline for that filing is a month later, or maybe in July. But at any rate, for most states in the US, it's May 15th to file your 990N or your 990EZ. So make note of that if you've never done this before. It's a pretty simple form to fill out, but you just need to have the credentials, the history. Again, that's information you will need to receive from a former treasurer or from your archives to know how to fill that out. The other thing that's due on the 15th is the annual financial report in 2023. It will be for the previous year, for 2022. And I put a note in here, which I kind of retained from last year, where James Bousquet, the previous STC treasurer who lives in Canada, if there's anyone in Canada who wants to know what, if anything, is required of you when it comes to your community finances, he's willing to chat with you about that. Okay. Next slide. And here at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Liz.
Okay, thank you, Bobbi. I'm glad to give your voice a break for a minute.
I'm gonna drink my tea.
Okay. So I have a few slides that I'd like to just go over with everyone that are about some housekeeping items that are just good practice for communities. And one of them has been something that's changed a little bit over the past couple of years, which is that chapters have had bank accounts for many years. A few of the things that we would like to point out to treasurers is that oftentimes treasurers have used their own personal home address for those accounts. And not always is that a good idea. If a treasurer for some reason has to leave the position, suddenly then the bank is associated with that home address. Some treasurers just don't want to use a home address. So we want to remind everybody that you can always use the STC address for your bank if they allow that. There are a handful of banks that want a local state address, and so that may complicate things. But for the most part, we've found that a lot of communities are able to change their address to the STC address. What may happen is that paper statements may come to the office, but in this day and age, most people can log on and still get their statements via statement. But if you need us to, we can always send you a scan of the statements that we receive in the office if we receive them. There are at least 3 or 4 chapters that are currently doing that, and it's working just fine for them. So that is one of the recommendations we would make. And then I also have a recommendation about co-signatories. We've had some issues with chapters that have lost a treasurer and they didn't change who was a signatory on the bank account before they, decided to leave their position. So we have a couple of recommendations. Another chapter leader could be a co-signatory on the bank account just to prevent that situation. Or if you prefer, you could also ask me to be a co-signatory as STC's CEO, as a trustee of your account. So that's just another option I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of. Next slide, please. So EIN addresses, Bobbi's already talked about the fact that you need to file your 990s. Your EIN is one of the things that you file with. I receive a list every year at the office of all of the community EINs that are subordinates to the parent organization, which is STC. And it will tell me the status. And a lot of times it will list addresses that you've associated with your chapter on that master list that I get from the IRS. Again, changing your address with the tax organization is maybe a good idea with the IRS to STC's address, because then you don't have to have your home address associated with the chapter. Again, any mail we get from the IRS on behalf of the chapters will be scanned and emailed to the treasurer. And generally, that's usually the only mail I usually get from the IRS is when a chapter has lost its EIN status. So that's when I'm writing you saying, you forgot to file and you need to correct that right away. Next slide, please. Another recommendation that we have is about email addresses. You may have heard about this a couple of ways. We've been talking about it for a while. But one of our recommendations is that you don't use community leaders, and we recommend this to the board of directors and anyone else who's associated with STC, not to use your work email address if you can avoid that. Just not to scare anyone, but anytime you use a work email address or any email address for a business, if for some reason there was a litigation against STC and email addresses needed to become discoverable, all of your work email would then become discoverable. And most people's businesses that they work for don't really want to get associated with a litigation that's not related. So it's really a best practice to set up your own STC email, maybe just a Gmail account. We've got an example there of Bobbi's. But in addition, a lot of communities are using personal email addresses for the chapter business. And we've had chapters successfully set up Gmail addresses or generic Gmail that they can pass from president to president, treasurer to treasurer. And an example here is, one for Atlanta. I don't think this is their actual address. I think I made this up, but presidentatl@gmail.com, something like that you can use and pass each year. And that way no one loses the continuity of the conversations of those email addresses. And hopefully, you are able to keep everything in one place for the community. So that's the other recommendation we have. Okay, I think that's all I have on those notes.
Okay, so, oh my goodness, that was really high pitched. Sorry about that. So we just want to share with you all a list of resources. And again, when we send out the recording and the slide deck, these are all clickable links that will take you to what you need. So there's a link to the 990N or the 990EZ, whichever applies to you. If you want to get some information about business income tax, we have that link for you. We also have a link to the current community treasurer handbook, but I will tell you that we're in the process of updating that handbook. In fact, Liz and I have a meeting, and Aaron as well, with Jim Bousquet as we're reworking that. We have a meeting tomorrow to begin to work through our final edits on that document. So later this fall, I anticipate that the revision to that handbook will be available, and we'll provide a different link at that time. If you can go on to the next slide, please. And then we have just a list of folks as well as the Slack channel that you can use to communicate any questions that you have about budgeting. The Slack channel, please take advantage of that. At this time of the year, I start disciplining myself to check that regularly. So if you have a question for me, I'll be there, or you can reach me by email as well. So we have myself, Aaron, Lori, and Liz as your primary contacts regarding budgets.
Bobbi, I have one other thing that I forgot to mention,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So one of the other things a few chapters have decided to do is to close their bank accounts completely and have STC hold their funds for them. In a few cases, it's just ease of not having to worry about the bank account, etc. So if that's something you're interested in, please drop me an email and we can discuss it. I know there are a couple of people on this call who are working on that process. I think we have at least 3 chapters that have chosen to do this now. So I just wanted to also mention that that is always another option. If you don't want to have a bank account as a chapter and you just want to get reimbursed, STC will keep a schedule of what your funds are, just like we do for SIGs. It's the same process. And we'll work with you when it's time to file your 990 to let you know what your amount is to file with. Thanks.
Good. So Lori, it's up to you.
Get off mute here. We're opening the floor for questions, and your questions are welcome. And just a quick note, as part of the Budget Review Committee, I, as the chair of the Community Affairs Committee, can help, answer questions about, how communities do things with budgets or anything else that's on your mind. And I can certainly share that with the committee. So just let you know you have my support as well. So questions open.
Looks like there's one in the chat from Lily, which I can go ahead and read. 990 can be filed as early as January 1, 2023, correct?
That would be correct if you have completed all of your operational business by then. So for example, you could be waiting on a reimbursement or something that would have, would be necessary to know about. So most people don't file like that day because they want to make sure all of the financial statements and everything are finalized. But if you really wanted to, you can. I'm sure the IRS would be delighted to get money that soon.
And if there are any other secondary, there's another question, but you can go ahead and put it in the chat, or if you prefer to ask it verbally, just state that quickly in the chat, just so we don't have individuals talking over each other, and then we can unmute and you can ask away. Just give it a moment.
So Lily, I see your question about asking for receipts. Yes, if you need to be reimbursed for a SIG or for anything really, even if it's a chapter reimbursement, I would recommend holding on to your receipts. But if you're getting reimbursed from STC, yes, we need to have receipts of anything that you've spent with your reimbursement request. And that's a requirement of our accounting firm.
Liz, I was just wondering, are there any formats that you prefer to get receipts in, whether it's scanned or PDFs or anything else? Or is there any format for a receipt that is not allowed?
Not to my knowledge. PDF is obviously the most accessible and easiest to work with because I just
Okay.
can upload it into, we use a company called bill.com for all of our payments processing. So it'll take multiple types of files, but most people have submitted those kinds of things via PDF.
Okay, thank you.
Right. And I think one other thing to remind everybody, if you are a new treasurer or are not currently in our payment processing system, you probably are going to need to fill out what we call a vendor form. I know you're not vendors, but that's just the name of the form that allows us to either go ahead and send you funds electronically. Most chapters have wanted to do that now because it just happens so quickly. But you do need to fill out a form that gives us all the information about the transfer and who's responsible on your side. If you don't want that, we can still do paper checks, but we're just finding that people tend to appreciate transfer.
And I would say too that within, I don't know what the standard time frame is from approval of a budget to when the checks are dispersed, but you should start watching for that to be either credited to your account or for the check to be delivered to whatever address you have provided. There have been cases where people didn't track it and they discovered late that they never received the payment. And, you know, and then we're in a new fiscal year, which makes that really problematic. So we want to make sure that you get the funding that's been approved. So please stay on top of it. Watch for those funds to be transferred or delivered in a check.
So
And
yeah,
just as an additional note, we will for bill.com, the envelope does not come from STC, so it may remind you as a junk envelope. You know, it may not immediately leap out at you as something you're looking for. So just make sure when you're receiving an envelope, if you're getting a paper check, to go ahead and open up the envelopes from bill.com, because that might be it. We also have had folks who have been confused because they were looking for something from STC home office.
right. That's a security thing that they do so that people don't know that a check's in the mail. And also, if you don't cash the check within 90 days, it will be returned to SDC or to bill.com. So that's the length of time you have to cash your check. And if not, then we're going to have to reissue it. And there are fees associated with doing that. So it's better if you can just keep an eye out for it when it's being passed. I see Trisha's question about funds held by STC. Would we need to pay our bills by our personal funds? Yes, unless you can get us some way to help you pay those. Like, you know, I could log in for you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bobbi.
I was going to say, if you had an invoice that
Right.
could be paid out by STC.
Yes, but we understand that, you know, that can be a difficult thing. We have a week-long period where we pay bills once a week, and they get processed once a week. So you could wait as much as 2 weeks for a payment, but hopefully not. And if you let us know that it's urgent, that helps as well. Katie, the vendor form will be sent to you by Aaron Galilee, probably when your funding is approved, just to make sure that we have all the correct information for each group. Aaron, is that right?
Yeah, I actually just dropped it in the chat, the form, the template of the form. So this will be what it looks like. We can review any information closer to, but this is the basic information that it is. The first page is good to have for just your contact information. So whether or not you're getting a paper check or electronic payment, that's just a contact information piece from you that we will need on everybody. The second page is primarily for those who are wanting electronic transfer, which will need to be completed and signed. So the second page is where we'll really need the signature. So don't miss that, because that will be turned right back around to you by our accounting folks.
Yeah, and Christine, we can look to see if we've already got you
Yes.
set up, but
Yes.
it's just better if you fill out the form again, because even if we have you set up, there could be something that's changed about your contact information or your address or whatever. And so sometimes that can delay a payment if it's not accurate.
And certainly if you've changed banks,
Yes,
that's going to be a factor.
right. We want to make sure we have the correct routing number and, bank account number. I think we've answered everything thus far, unless there are more questions. We have plenty of time.
Yeah, there are no more questions in the chat, it looks like, so. Look here. I don't think we've missed anything here. Yeah, I think we've covered everything pretty much in the chat.
Do any of the veteran treasurers out there have words of wisdom to share with others on the call?
Oh, good question, Bobbi.
I'm waiting for some good answers. So
Lily, what are your individual questions about? Are they about just submitting the budget? Because Erin is always there for all communities as the staff liaison to communities, as a community director. And I would recommend just starting there. And if it's something that she can't answer, she can find one of us to elevate it to. She's been doing this a few years now, so yeah, she can give you some of that information, definitely. In fact, we could probably even put together a sample of a really good budget submission, strip out whose it is, and show you kind of what a good one looks like, if that helps.
I'll take that on as a task.
Okay, great, Bobbi. Yeah, I think that there's, as Bobbi said earlier in the meeting, you can't really give us too much information. If we don't need it, we can, just kind of scroll past it. But anything you tell us about how you're planning to spend your funding or make funds helps us with understanding what the community's doing. Tricia has given us some advice. That's great. That's great. She recommends keeping on top of all your expenses and income each month. She keeps a ledger in Google Sheets, which is fantastic. Use the same categories as on the budget template so you can easily sort and filter for STC reports. Cool, that's helpful, thank you. I know another recommendation we always have for communities is to pull your membership list each month. So you know how many members you have, from month to month, and make sure you're reaching out to them and connecting with them. That way, when August 31st rolls around, you're not surprised by how many members you may think you have when we do the budget process.
Right, and Erin sends out the communication that gives you the numbers that we had on record for August 31st. If you see any issues with that at all, please reach out and have a conversation with Erin so we can see what the reason is for the discrepancy.
Yeah. So just to answer Lily, easy groups are groups that have less than $50,000 in revenue each year. 990N are people or communities that have more. So most communities are easy, and that form is super easy to fill out, which is nice because there's not as much reporting that has to be done when you are a lower income group.
One thing I just mentioned is that this isn't, of course, the only opportunity to ask questions. If you ever get stuck, don't wait for us to come to you after your budget has been submitted, or ask us at any point. We can always help you along that way when we get your budget, it's all clean and done, and we know what's happening with you. We've had conversations with you, so it'll go a lot faster for you. Versus, we're nice people. We're here to help.
And don't be afraid to ask any question, because, you know, if you figure, oh, I should already know that, feel free to ask anyway, because it never hurts to confirm and verify. So,
I'm still
Awesome.
learning about
yeah.
a lot of this. So, and I was a treasurer of a chapter for years. But in this role, there's so many things that are new. So just own what you don't know and find a way to figure it out. Don't be shy to ask questions at all. And if I don't know the answer, I ask Liz or I ask Erin.
And if we don't know the answer, we'll find it somehow.
That's
We
right.
do research. Oh, one other thing I've thought of while we're waiting to see if any other questions come in is that some of you, as chapter leaders and SIGs, may be planning to send someone to the conference this year. I just want to alert you that when you do your budget, don't just put in the amount for the conference that you put in last year, because the rates have increased. So make sure you look at the registration page and put in the amount of funding you're going to support for that person. If it's the whole conference rate, or if it's less for the summit, that's fine. But it's not $925 this year again, and all communities will be offered the lowest rate, which is currently $1,300. So if you are going to send someone to the conference, we won't make you pay a higher rate than that, if you're going to cover the whole expense.
All right, so I think it's been a couple minutes since we did our last ask and nothing new has come in. So I would just encourage the group that if anything pops up, to please reach out to anybody on the committee itself. And if you're not remembering any of the email addresses, you can look at the documentation that we sent out about it. But you could always just send a note to stc@stc.org, and that'll get at least to us so we can get it to the appropriate group, the people who need their eyes on it. Thank you so much for coming out today. A reminder that everybody who's registered for this event will receive a link right to the recording, but it will be also posted on the CAC Leadership Resources page of the STC website for you to review also at your leisure. Thank you very much.
One more slide.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you to
Yes.
everybody.
Yeah, we want to thank all of those who volunteer for our hardworking communities. And as chair of the Community Affairs Committee, I really deeply appreciate everything, all the effort that people are putting in, and especially to our newer volunteers who are still kind of feeling out the ground. We welcome you heartily, and all the people that are veteran volunteers as well. All of it is most appreciated. And the CAC will be planning some events in the next coming months. So we will send communication out about those events. I would love to meet as many of you online as possible. It's always a pleasure to meet and get to know other chapter leaders. So I'm really looking forward to that. And Bobbi, thank you so much. And Liz, for a very informative presentation. I always learn something from this stuff, even though I was only a chapter treasurer for a couple of months. You know, this is very informative and very helpful. So thank you. And thank you all for coming.
Yes. Thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate it.
I have no more voice.
No, you need to go rest. Drink some tea.
Thanks, everyone.